we need to discuss something that is being actively ignored. Something the financial media and politicians in Washington are praying you won't notice. The economist Richard Wolff, one of the few voices daring to state the inconvenient obvious, has articulated what many of us have felt in our bones for months. The $35 trillion debt bubble is no longer a future problem. It isn't something for our grandchildren to deal with. It has just burst. And what nobody seems to understand is that, as Wolff said, no one is prepared. When you hear that number, $35 trillion, it sounds abstract, almost like monopoly money. The traditional media, the system's spokespeople, are quick to downplay it. They say, we owe it to ourselves. They say that as long as the GDP is growing, the debt is manageable. They tell you that the United States, as the issuer of the world's reserve currency, can simply print what it needs. Let me state something that no one in the United States, whether in New York or Washington, dares to acknowledge aloud: they are lying. They are not lying because they are evil, although some are. They are lying because they are panicking. They are lying because the alternative, facing reality, is simply too terrifying for them. What no one is prepared to admit is that the emperor isn't just naked, he is bankrupt, mortgaged, and his creditors are knocking at the door. This number, $35 trillion, and climbing by $1 trillion every 100 days, is not just an accounting problem. It is the death certificate of a system. It is the bill that has finally come due after 50 years of imperial hubris. It is the cost of policing the world. It is the cost of maintaining 800 military bases across the globe. It is the cost of waging endless wars in the Middle East, financed not with taxes, but with debt purchased by your now adversaries. It is the cost of deindustrializing your own country, sending jobs to China and Mexico in exchange for cheap goods and inflated quarterly profits for Wall Street. The central thesis of this channel, the critical compass, and the truth that permeates every analysis we conduct, is this: the American empire is in terminal decline, but its elites, whether Democrat or Republican, whether globalists or nationalists like Donald Trump, are in a state of deep, profound psychological denial. This debt bubble is the physical manifestation of that denial. They genuinely believe their own propaganda. They believe the end of history had arrived in the 90s. They believe they could print dollars from nothing and exchange them for real goods, real labor, and real resources from the rest of the world, forever. They believe the power of the dollar, backed not by gold, but by the military might of aircraft carriers, was eternal. But that era is over. What we are witnessing, what Richard Wolff is pointing out, is not a budget problem. It is not something that can be fixed with a spending cut here or a tax hike there. It is a structural collapse. The old tools of the empire, the very tools they used to keep the world in line for 70 years, are now backfiring. The sanctions, meant to bring Russia to its knees, only strengthened BRICS and accelerated de-dollarization. The tariffs, meant to bring the jobs back, only caused inflation at home and made their own companies less competitive. And the power of the dollar, the ultimate weapon, has become its own noose. And while they look the other way, obsessed with domestic political theater, a new, multipolar world, more resilient, more intelligent, and more sovereign, is quietly building the emergency exits and leaving the empire behind with its unpayable bill. Let us analyze the evidence. Let us dissect why Wolff is right, why the bubble has just burst, and why the establishment is so utterly unprepared. The first piece of evidence, the first pillar of the collapse, is not the debt principle itself. It's not the $35 trillion. The real killer, the thing that burst the bubble, is the interest on that debt. You see, for decades, the United States could roll over this debt at near zero interest rates. The Federal Reserve, the central bank, kept borrowing costs artificially low. This allowed Congress to spend like a drunken sailor, knowing the cost of carrying that debt was minimal. But then, something happened. The very system they created began to devour them. First came the pandemic and the lockdowns, and Washington's response was to print trillions of dollars and hand them directly to the people and to large corporations. This, combined with supply chain disruptions caused by their own tariff policies and geopolitical tensions, created the worst inflation in 40 years. Inflation, remember, is the invisible tax on the poor. It is the theft of your savings. The Federal Reserve, caught in its own trap, was forced to do something it hadn't done in a long time: raise interest rates. They needed to fight the inflation they themselves had created. They needed to look like they were in control. They began raising interest rates at the fastest pace in history. What they didn't tell you, what the media refuses to explain, is the catastrophic consequence of this decision. Every percentage point increase in interest rates didn't just apply to new loans or mortgages. It applied to the rollover of that $35 trillion mountain of debt. And now, the unthinkable has happened. The interest payments on the United States national debt have exploded. They have surpassed $1 trillion a year. Think about that. $1 trillion per year. That is more than the entire U.S. defense budget. It is more than they spend on all non-retirement social programs. $1 trillion that builds no schools, paves no roads, and pays no soldiers. It is money that goes directly into the pockets of creditors, Wall Street banks, and, ironically, the foreign nations that still hold their bonds. This, my friends, is what we call a debt-death spiral. It is the point of no return. When the cost of servicing your debt becomes one of your largest expenses, you are finished. The system is broken. The bubble has burst. Because now, the U.S. government is trapped. To pay this $1 trillion in interest, they have only 3 options, and all of them are economic and political suicide. Option 1, massive spending cuts. They would have to cut the Pentagon in half. They would have to decimate Social Security, Medicare. Politically impossible. The military-industrial complex and the retiree lobby would burn Washington to the ground. Option 2, massive tax hikes. Trying to wring another $1 trillion from a working class and businesses already suffocated by inflation and foreign competition. This would cause a revolt and an immediate economic depression. So, what is left? Option 3. The only option they ever choose. The coward's way out. The option of an empire in denial. They print the money. The Federal Reserve simply creates more dollars from thin air so the Treasury can pay the interest on the debt. But wait. Isn't that precisely what caused the inflation in the first place? Yes. Here is the diabolical trap they have fallen into, the self-inflicted wound they cannot admit. To pay the interest on the debt that exploded because of the interest rate hikes, they must now print more money. But printing more money causes more inflation. And to fight that new inflation, the Federal Reserve would have to raise interest rates even higher. And if they raise interest rates further, the interest payments on $35 trillion of debt will go to $1.5 trillion, $2 trillion a year. It is a death spiral. It is a perpetual inflation engine. They can neither stop printing nor stop raising rates. Whichever path they choose leads to collapse. They are, like a cartoon character, running off a cliff and refusing to look down. And who pays the price for this theater of the absurd? We do. The people. The worker. While the Washington elite and Wall Street bankers are protected, their assets, their stocks, their luxury real estate rise with inflation, it is the average American who is being cannibalized by the system. It is the hidden tax of inflation. When you go to the supermarket and see that prices have doubled, that is not just corporate greed, though that exists. That is the government stealing the purchasing power of your dollar to pay the interest on wars you didn't ask for and bank bailouts you didn't approve. The $35 trillion debt bubble is not an abstract problem. It is the reason you are working more hours for less real value. It is the reason your children may never be able to afford a home. The empire is no longer just exploiting distant colonies. In its final, desperate phase, it has begun to devour its own population. And the political denial in Washington is the clearest proof of this. What do you see on television? Democrats and Republicans fighting. It is pure theater. They are not fighting over whether to spend. They are only fighting over how to spend the money they do not have. The Democrats want to spend trillions on green energy subsidies, which, in practice, are just wealth transfers to their friendly corporations. The Republicans, and Donald Trump is the master of this, want to spend trillions on tax cuts for billionaires and more money for the Pentagon to rebuild our military. Both, without exception, increase the debt. When Trump was in office, he added nearly $8 trillion to the debt. Biden has continued at the same pace. They are two sides of the same bankrupt coin. They fight over the debt ceiling as if it's a real debate. It is a farce. A show for the cameras. They always raise the ceiling. Because they have to. If they stopped, if they actually tried to live within their means, the global financial system would collapse overnight. The late-stage, financialized capitalist system, as we know it, cannot survive without ever larger doses of debt. It is a heroin addict that needs a bigger fix each day just to function. The denial is not just psychological, it is built into the system. They have amputated the arm that feeds them. By deindustrializing the country, they destroyed their own tax base. They traded factories that produced real value for a service and financial casino economy. They thought they could simply print the money to make up the difference. But they forgot a fundamental rule of economics, a rule that China, Russia, and even almost Mexico seem to have understood far better. Money only has value if you produce things the world wants to buy. The United States has stopped producing things. It produces debt. It produces inflation. And it produces weapons. And now, the bill has come due. The bubble burst because, for the first time in history, the rest of the world is beginning to refuse this debt. The rest of the world no longer wants to finance the American lifestyle in exchange for worthless printed paper. They are looking at the $35 trillion, looking at the dysfunctional theater in Washington, looking at the inflation the US tries to export, and they are saying, no, thank you. This is the crux of the matter. This is where the denial of the Washington elites meets the hard reality of the rest of the world. What happens when you have a $35 trillion debt, growing by $1 trillion every 100 days, and you need the rest of the world to buy that debt so your system doesn't implode? Well, for 50 years, the world bought it. They bought it because they needed dollars to buy oil from the Middle East, the petrodollar system. They bought it because the US was the consumer center of the world. They bought it because US military power guaranteed their bonds were the safest asset in the world. All of that is no longer true. And this is where we enter the second part of our analysis, the most devastating proof of the empire's collapse, the quiet, strategic rise of the multipolar world. While the United States was busy printing money and waging war with itself in a distracting political theater, the rest of the world was building. They were building an alternative system. A system that does not depend on the dollar, does not depend on Washington's permission, and no longer bows to threats from the US Treasury. The clearest symbol of this, of course, is BRICS. For years, the Western media mocked BRICS. They called it a talking shop, an empty acronym invented by a Goldman Sachs banker. They are not laughing anymore. Or rather, they are laughing in public, but panicking in private. The statistic they pray you never hear is this: the BRICS bloc, especially after its recent expansion to include energy powerhouses like Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and Iran, alongside regional powers like Egypt and Ethiopia, now represents a combined GDP, measured in purchasing power parity, that is larger than that of the G7. I will repeat that, because it is the economic death sentence of the old system. The group of emerging and developing nations is now economically larger than the club of old colonial empires and their overlord, the United States. What does this mean in practice? It means that for the first time since 1944, a viable alternative exists. When China wants to buy oil from Saudi Arabia, it no longer needs to use the US dollar. It can pay in renminbi, the yuan. And it does. When India wants to buy oil from Russia, which is under US sanctions. It doesn't listen to Washington. It laughs. It buys the oil in rupees and rubles at a deep discount, and its economy grows at 8% a year, while Europe, which obeyed Washington, commits industrial suicide and enters a recession. What did the sanctions against Russia prove to the world? They did not prove US power. They proved US recklessness. When the United States, in an act of unprecedented imperial arrogance, confiscated hundreds of billions of dollars of Russia's foreign reserves, they didn't just punish Russia. They sent a warning message to every other country in the world: your money is not safe with us. If you disobey us politically, we will steal it. That was the self-inflicted wound that accelerated de-dollarization by a decade. Leaders in Asia, Africa, Latin America, they all looked at that and said, am I next? I must get rid of my dollar exposure, and I must do it now. And BRICS was there, waiting, with a plan. They are building BRICS, a central bank digital currency platform for cross-border trade settlement. They are expanding the new development bank, the BRICS Bank, to finance infrastructure in the global south, without the predatory, neoliberal conditionalities of the US-controlled IMF and World Bank. The multipolar world is voting with its feet. They are selling US Treasury bonds. Slowly, quietly, but steadily. China, Japan, Saudi Arabia, all are reducing their holdings. And who is buying this debt that the rest of the world no longer wants? Nobody. The Federal Reserve has to print the money to buy it. This is what they call debt monetization. It is the final stage. It is the snake eating its own tail. They no longer need the world to buy their debt, they just need the world not to sell it in a panic. But the panic has already begun. It is a slow, controlled panic, but it is why Wolff is right. The bubble has burst. The trust is gone. But the multipolar force is not just statistical. It is also ideological. Let us look at the example the US establishment hates more than any other: Mexico. The neighbor they have always treated as their backyard. Mexico, under the leadership of Andrés Manuel López Obrador, AMLO, committed the cardinal sin in Washington's eyes. He proved the neoliberal model is wrong. For 30 years, Mexico followed the Washington Consensus playbook. Privatize everything. Cut social spending. Open your markets. Let foreign capital do as it pleases. The result? Stagnant wages, explosive cartel violence, and a country being hollowed out from within. AMLO arrived and did the exact opposite. He used the power of the state for the people. He massively increased pension payments to the elderly. He doubled the minimum wage. And most importantly, he reversed the privatization of Mexico's strategic sectors. He poured billions into Pemex, the state oil company, and CFE, the electricity company. The experts in Washington, the same ones who didn't see the 2008 crisis coming, all screamed in unison, this is a disaster. It's populism. Mexico will go bankrupt. And what happened? The Mexican peso, instead of collapsing, became the super peso. The strongest currency in the world against the dollar for years. Inflation in Mexico was lower than in the United States. Foreign direct investment, not speculative capital, but investment in real factories, flooded the country. AMLO proved that sovereignty works. He proved that investing in your own people, rather than in Wall Street bankers, is the path to prosperity. He exposed the central lie of the empire. And he did it calmly, with dignity, and without asking for permission. And then, we have the technological proof. China. For decades, the narrative in the US was that China just copied. That they couldn't innovate. It was a comfortable lie the elites told themselves as they shut down factories in the Rust Belt and sent the jobs to Shanghai. Well, China learned. And now, China innovates. And in crucial sectors, it dominates. Take the case of electric vehicles. While the United States is still debating if climate change is real and its old automakers like Ford and GM struggle to build batteries that don't catch fire, China, with companies like BYD, has not just caught up, it has surpassed the entire West. BYD, alone, produces more electric vehicles than almost the entire rest of the world combined. And they aren't just more numerous. They are better. And, crucially, they are cheaper. China dominates the entire supply chain. From the lithium mines to the battery management software. What is the empire's response to this competition? They cheat. Joe Biden and Donald Trump, two faces of the same imperial coin, have no answer. They cannot compete. So, what do? Tariffs. They impose 100% tariffs on Chinese EVs. They ban TikTok. They try to strangle China's access to semiconductors. This is not an act of strength. It is an act of desperation. It is the public admission that the free market they preached to the world for 50 years was a farce. That the free market only works as long as the United States is winning. When they start to lose, they change the rules. But, as we've already seen, this tool, tariffs, is just another shot in the foot. It is a tax paid by their own American consumers. It makes their own cars more expensive. It ensures their own EV industry remains complacent, protected, and less competitive, while China conquers the rest of the world. Asia, Latin America, Africa, and even Europe. The empire is locking itself inside its own walls, while the multipolar world moves on without it. And this brings us to Act 4. The ultimate symbol of this entire tragedy. The personification of denial. Donald Trump. It is crucial to understand that Donald Trump is not the cause of American decline. He is the symptom. He is the high fever of a sick empire. He is the personification of psychological denial. When Trump looks at the Rust Belt, at the workers whose jobs were exported by elites from both parties, what does he offer? Does he offer real solutions? Does he talk about the $35 trillion debt spiral? Does he talk about the failure of the Federal Reserve? Does he talk about the end of dollar hegemony? Of course not. That would require him to admit that the very financialized capitalist system, from which he is a prime beneficiary, has failed. Instead, what does he offer? Theater. He offers bluster. He offers scapegoats. He doesn't blame the CEO who closed the factory. He blames the Mexican immigrant who is fleeing the devastation that U.S. policies caused in his own country. He doesn't blame the Wall Street bankers who financed deindustrialization. He blames China for stealing our jobs, as if the jobs were stolen and not handed over on a silver platter in exchange for quarterly profits. He talks about building the wall. The wall is the perfect metaphor for the empire in its final phase. It is an act of futility. It is a distraction. It is an attempt to keep the world out, while the real problem is in here. The real problem is the money printer in the Federal Reserve's basement. The real problem is the trillions in interest payments. The real problem is that the country no longer produces what the world needs, except weapons and debt. Trump is the perfect distraction. The elites, both Democrat and Republican, love that he is on the stage. Because while the media, and the people, are obsessed 24/7 with his latest tweet, his latest lawsuit, his latest outrageous statement. No one is looking at the debt bubble. No one is looking at BRICS building an alternative financial system. No one is asking why the interest payments are now larger than the Pentagon budget. Trump is the master of ceremonies for the collapse. He is denial in its loudest, most orange form. He promises to make America great again, but his only tools are the very ones that cause the collapse. More tax cuts for the rich, financed by more debt, more tariffs, which cause more inflation, and more militarism, which expands the unsustainable empire. He is, as we said, the symptom. He is the illusion that a strongman can, by yelling, reverse the inevitable tides of history and economics. But he cannot. No one can. And that is why we are here. The $35 trillion debt bubble, as Richard Wolff correctly points out, has already burst. It is not a question of if the system freezes, but when. The bursting is not a single event, like in 2008. It is a process. It is the inflation you feel at the grocery store. It is the impossible rise in mortgage rates. It is the slow loss of confidence in the dollar. The elites in Washington, whether Trump or Biden, are in deep denial. They are the musicians on the deck of the Titanic, arguing over which song to play as the ship sinks. They are trapped in the illusion that the system that made them rich can last forever. But the world has moved on. The multipolar world is not in denial. It is building the alternatives. It is preparing for what comes next. The empire is in desperation, but the change is real. The change is inevitable. And the viewer, like you, who has watched this analysis to the end, now knows the truth. You are no longer in denial. You understand. If this analysis has made you see the world through new eyes, if you understand that there is a struggle for dignity happening, then do not remain silent. Share this video so that more people can understand what the mainstream media will never explain.